Now, there are growing indications that the Islamic State group is reorganizing in Iraq, 2 years after it lost the last of its territory in the country. Now, intelligence experts say IS attacks are increasing and becoming a lot more sophisticated. A former British ambassador to Iraq, Sir John Jenkins, says IS has successfully regrouped before.
The difference now is that there are more of them in more places than there were in 2013, which was the last time they rose. They have more money as well. The amount of money they made during a physical caliphate was extraordinary, and the UN estimate that they still have access to something like $50 to $300 million worth of that. So they're actually in a better position than they were in 2013.
Olivier Guitta is from the geopolitical security firm Global Strat.
We've had sources on the ground for the past 6 months telling us that IS was coming back, especially with operations at night, but also still doing racketeering operations, still controlling villages in Iraq. So unfortunately, it's not a surprise. And that's the tactic of all those different insurgency groups to do that.
Well, maybe you can help explain that a bit more then. To what extent are they regrouping? What does IS regrouping mean? How do we see it?
So a couple of things. If you remember, we had in the past year and a half, when it was time to clear some of the cities, the coalition made a deal with Islamic State jihadists for them basically to get out of those cities to avoid a massive bloodshed, and they were offered free passage. So all those people are not all of a sudden going to turn back and become good citizens, if you will. So we knew that this reservoir of jihadists would come back one day or another. But it was better for, I guess, PR issues and saving lives to just have a deal with the jihadists. But that was counterintuitive to anything we can think of when we talk about war tactics. So this reservoir and also access to money is still valid when we talk to IS regrouping. So you have this confluence of money, human capital, but also a will and an eagerness to basically come back and to wait for the quote-unquote occupying forces to leave. I mean, we've had this time and again, and, IS is really a resurgence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and IS 2.0, if we call it this way, is basically following that same model.
Well, therefore, if the occupying forces, as they call them, and as you said they call them, aren't budging, or maybe they are going to budge, how prepared are security forces in the area to deal with this resurgence, if at all?
So they are more prepared than they were, obviously, 4 years ago. But the issue is really covering a whole slew of terrain, and also you're fighting less of a classical army that was the case when Islamic State was at its heydays, when it was turning into a real army. Now it's back to being an insurrection group that has the tactics, the knowledge of the ground, but also possibly scaring off the different population. As well, this added to Iraq, which is in shambles politically, that has to face a huge political crisis where there's no real government. So that's a void that Islamic State is going to use extremely opportunistically, and I'm afraid that they could make inroads because of the factors that I just described.
Yeah, you've mentioned this before, haven't you? This political instability and the vacuum, the current unrest in Iraq, Baghdad, it just enables resurgence, doesn't it?
Yes. I mean, the jihadists flourish on countries where there's a political vacuum, and they are extremely strong and opportunistic when it comes to filling that vacuum. And we've seen in the past, obviously, Islamic State was also well known and tried to charm the population in a way to say, look, we're providing social services, we're providing electricity, water, something that the government was never able to provide. So that's one aspect that they can really try to get on the public much more on their sides, while the central government in Baghdad is non-existent, and we're going into a long, protracted political crisis there.
I know it's a sad question just in the way it's asked, but what threat are they to the West?
That group, which we would call Islamic State, really in Iraq, is not potentially a major threat to the West when it comes to the sort of attacks we saw in 2015 in France and in Brussels in 16 and in the UK. Because it's not a central operation, it's much a localized group rather than a group that had an external wing, if you will. The group in itself will remain a major problem for the West in terms of the image, the psyche, but also the motivation to still being a part of it and using Islamic State as a brand to potentially carry out attacks in Europe.